Hello, and welcome to our weekly dialogue with Helga Zepp-LaRouche. She's the founder and chairwoman of the Schiller Institute. Today is February 7th, 2024. I'm Harley Schlanger, and I will be your host today. You can send us your questions or comments via email to questions@schillerinstitute.org, or you can post them in the YouTube chat room. Now, Helga, it seems as though each week when we get together, the tensions between the dying unipolar order and the emerging new paradigm deepen, and the need for a mobilization of citizens in the global north becomes more urgent as the establishment keeps escalating wars and provocations. To address this, the LaRouche organization has released a statement which is available for circulation, and I would urge people to download it and circulate it. It's, quote, "Knew or should have known governments complicit in genocide will not be able to plead ignorance at the coming Nuremberg tribunal." Now, since so many of our questions, such as that of our friend Menashe, address the matter of what can be done to replace the dying system, let's start there. What can people do to make a difference?
Well, I think the first thing is naturally that everything must be done to save the Palestinians who are in a, hour by hour fight for their life. Basically, when on the same day where the Den Haag International Court of Justice made a ruling that there was plausible genocide going on and making a verdict that the Israeli government must do everything to prevent the genocide, and that they would be asked to report on their progress in this endeavor 4 weeks later. That very same day, we had the decision to they discovered the so-called collaboration of 12 of 13,000 UNRWA collaborators. UNRWA is the one aid organization which is entirely responsible for the maintaining of Palestinian refugees, not only in Palestine, in Gaza and the West Bank, but also in Jordan, where there are 6 million Palestinians depending on UNRWA. So when they discovered that, basically the idea was that this is a terrorist collaboration, therefore all funds must be cut. And given the fact that that's the only organization which provides food and medicine and other important things for the people imprisoned in Gaza, it basically comes down like a death sentence. And the various governments, I think altogether 18 governments, immediately said that they would cut all funding for UNRWA. And then several days later, the IDF announced that they would flood the tunnels of Hamas. So now you have almost 2 million Palestinians being in a very tiny area near the city or in the city of Rafah, near the Egyptian or at the Egyptian border. And, Egypt is making it very clear they will not allow the dislocation of the Palestinians into the Sinai. And the IDF has said that they will bring the military campaign into this small territory. So, and Netanyahu has also refused to stop the fighting. So I think, given the fact that this is a genocide happening in front of our very eyes, I think that any person who is not a complete barbarian and a complete moron and actually Nuremberg criminal must help to stop this dying. And there must be an absolute escalation of international pressure to resume the funding of UNRWA. Even if these 12 individuals would have collaborated with Hamas, that is in no proportion to the effect it has to cut off the entire funding from the entire organization, because it is a death sentence for the entire Palestinian population. So we have suggested a various means which you are welcomed, and actually I'm asking you to download and make demonstration in front of the 18 countries, their embassies and consulates, that they should resume funding. Naturally, we must have an immediate ceasefire and a two-state solution, and that is actually the overwhelming position of the Arab League, of all the neighbors in the region, and even a plan which is being negotiated right now between Egypt, Hamas, and some others. So I think join this mobilization, because that is the first order. And naturally, secondly, I think you have to join the forces who are mobilizing. I mean, there are many, many international peace organizations. We from the Schiller Institute have every Friday a Zoom conference of the International Peace Coalition. You should absolutely join that. And, there the marching orders are being discussed every week. On the larger picture, we need a new paradigm of cooperation, because only if we stop this geopolitical confrontation between the so-called West and the so-called global South, because that's really what it's all about, that we can end the danger of an escalation to war. So, since an individual alone can do indeed very little, I can only invite you full-heartedly to join our efforts, because once you are part of this larger mobilization, you can be extremely important, because it is in a moment of history like this where the courage and the determination of only a few individuals, they must be in the thousands and many thousands, but nevertheless it can absolutely make the difference.
Now, we have some questions on the International Court of Justice provisional rulings and the ignoring of these rulings from Israel. Let me give you the two questions. The first one is short. What will the International Court of Justice do after 30 days have passed? Because they gave Israel 30 days to answer. The second one is from Angela Scarinci from Italy, who points out that while the court said that the accusations of genocide are plausible, therefore countries helping Israel by sending weapons and money could be accused of complicity. And she brings up the cutting of funds to UNRWA as an example of that. And she says, given the number of countries involved, Professor Francis Boyle says Israel has succeeded in making the enforcement of the accusation nearly impossible. Is this really so?
Well, I'm naturally not in the shoes of the judges, but, I mean, Israel and, also the other countries who are enabling Israel by sending weapons and finances, to my knowledge, have done absolutely nothing to stop the genocide. And, I mean, that is a fact. And in a certain sense, the opposite has occurred. They have doubled down by, launching this story about the UNRWA collaboration with Hamas, which, as I said, I cannot judge, but there's the question of proportionality. If 13,000 UNRWA employees are responsible to maintain the livelihood of these people, 12 to 13,000. I mean, basically what it would mean if the funding is ended, and they have already said that it will go out by the end of February, that means nothing will function anymore, and not just in Gaza. There are, over the years, there have been 6 million Palestinians settled in Jordan, and they are entirely financed by UNRWA. So there is the additional factor that, once the funding would be ended, then what happens to these 6 million people in Jordan? Then the Geneva Convention, Refugee Convention, would also affect them, which right now there is a clause which exempts them because of the UNRWA agreement. But if the UNRWA agreement stops, then all these people would be covered by the Geneva Convention, which would mean, that they would have the right for asylum in Europe. So you could imagine that a very large number of them would try to escape certain deaths from hunger and other perils, and you would have a refugee crisis, flooding Europe in ways which these people who are, absolutely not thinking about and obviously have no empathy whatsoever. But that is something which must be made also known, and I can only say we have to assert maximum pressure on these governments that decision is being reversed. Now, I cannot imagine that with all the horrible news, which are, after all, in our living room every day. It's not like, that everything is happening behind walls and where people cannot see it. This is coming into our living rooms every day. So I cannot imagine that, comes this day of the provisional review by the Court of Justice, that they will not come to the conclusion that this is an ongoing genocide.
Well, you're listening to Helga Zepp-LaRouche, the founder and chairwoman of the Schiller Institute, and we're taking your questions and comments. You can send them to us at questions@schillerinstitute.org. And we have a few questions coming in now. One from a contact in Fort Worth, Texas, who writes, I remember how contemptuous your husband was toward Henry Kissinger and his shuttle diplomacy in the Middle East, which seemed to make war more likely. Now, clearly, Blinken is no Kissinger, but what the hell is he trying to do with his shuttle diplomacy in the Middle East?
Well, that is a $64 million question, I mean, if the United States wanted to make a difference, all they would have to do is to cut the weapons and to cut the money to Israel and basically tell them that they have to stop. It's not that, my husband was very emphatic on that point, when people started to talk about the Zionist lobby is controlling the United States. He would always say, no, you got it completely upside down. It is the United States and the British, it's the Anglosphere which is controlling Israel, and they're using Israel when they have geopolitical intentions. They're using Israel every time as a hand grenade you can throw into the situation. And I think, given the fact that, Israel is just a small country, and the United States is still the major economic and also military power. One can debate if Russia is first or the United States. I think the recent weapon breakthroughs in Russia make actually Russia the number one. But nevertheless, if you look at all these aircraft carriers and other warships deployed in the Mediterranean, and I think some in the Gulf, the military power of the United States is sizable, and I think the responsibility is really primarily in Washington and London to stop this.
Now we have a couple of questions on the matter of accountability, because one thing that's clear is that the International Court of Justice provisional measures does establish a principle of accountability. And so we have these two questions, one from Philip Barton, who asks, can you explain why the US taxpayers pay to weaponize the government against its own citizens and its allies? And he refers to the Rand Institute study commissioned before the Ukraine war, which justified US destruction of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline to cut off Russian markets, destroy the German economy, and escalate a Ukrainian civil war from 2014, which the US was involved in. And he says, where's the accountability for Nuland, Blinken, Sullivan, Pyatt, Harris, and Biden? And then from Michelle Boyle from Belfast, she says, given the gangsters, which is exactly what they are, that they ignore the will of the people, who's going to take the action necessary to make sure they are arrested immediately and tried for their crimes? So, two questions on accountability.
Well, I think this question will come to a head. Well, first of all, in the US, they basically, the Republicans basically made very clear that they will block any funding for Ukraine. And Biden accused Trump of doing the work for Putin. And, so what that means is, given the fact that the military situation in Ukraine looks really very desperate for the Ukrainians, and basically, if there's no more funding coming from the United States, the pressure will be enormously on the Europeans, on Germany in particular. But that also is running into major problems, because the German economy is collapsing in a free fall right now in ways it has not even sunk into the conscience of the world public so far. And that in large part due to the sabotage of Nord Stream 2, for which ominously the Swedish government has just decided that they will close the investigation, and they have found nothing. So this is running up to a crisis point, and the only reasonable thing would be to have a mobilization of the population, demanding there again a diplomatic solution. Because if you don't go for that, one Russian general, whose name I have now forgotten, he just said that if in the context also of the extremely big NATO maneuver of 90,000 people being deployed until May, a steadfast defender, where the scenario is for the first time naming Russia in a maneuver as the possible attacker of a NATO country. That's the maneuver. But you have 90,000 troops in deployment exercises and so forth. And that is always an extreme danger zone, where, if things go really wrong, you could move from a maneuver into a real fight in no time, because you are already in motion. So this is always a time of extreme tension and danger, and especially now with the situation on the ground in Ukraine. So this Russian general basically warned that if NATO under these conditions would send any kind of deployment, a NATO deployment into Ukraine, that the situation could escalate to the nuclear level immediately. So we are sitting on a complete powder keg. The situation in Southwest Asia, if the war there expands to Lebanon and other so-called Iranian proxies, and eventually would involve Iran, you could go into a nuclear escalation there. And if something like what I just mentioned before would happen in Ukraine, this would be the same thing. So I think we are really in a extremely dangerous moment of history, and naturally this is all fueled by the fact that the US is having the election campaign. So these are always Trump, apparently, I didn't see it myself, but apparently he, according to Fox News, said in a speech in Laconia in New Hampshire that he thinks that nuclear war could happen even before the US election takes place. Now, I don't know what Trump is basing this on, if he did indeed say it, but I can only agree with the general situation that we are in an absolute. I think it's never has been so dangerous like right now, and therefore anybody who is in their right mind must mobilize and exert pressure on the politicians to go for diplomatic solutions, both in Ukraine and also in Southwest Asia.
Now, Helga, we're getting a number of questions that are basically parallel, and that's why I'm giving you two at a time. But I think it's interesting that people are tending to think in ways that are moving toward a solution. But we have from a viewer in Serbia. Asks, why are Western neocons so hostile to Iran? Iran actually played a major role against ISIS and the so-called Islamic terrorists. Is it because they believe in the clash of civilizations theory, or is there another reason? And we have a question from Anthony who asks, if more people knew about NATO's alliance with international terrorist mastermind Abdul Rasul Sayyaf, who is Khalid Sheikh Mohammed's boss, do you think that knowledge would change anything?
Well, I think it has to do with the fact that the geopolitical idea is still what dominates the thinking of people. I mean, if you think that the world is a zero-sum game, that when one wins, the other loses, and that you have the idea that control of raw materials is what creates your power and all of these things, then you end up in a situation like in the 20th century, where geopolitics was the basic reason for 2 world wars. And obviously right now, what is underlying all of these conflicts is the fact that obviously in the last, I would say 30 years, 20 years, especially the last 10 years, the rise of Asia, not just China. China had the most spectacular economic miracle in history ever by lifting 850 people of its own population out of poverty, and in the last 10 years has offered for other nations of the global south to take part in such an economic development, which gave these countries for the first time the chance to, not be raw material exporters, but to start to add to the value chain in their own country with the perspective of becoming middle income countries in the near future, which has caused a tremendous optimism in the global south, because China now is a very strong economic partner, and therefore, these countries in Africa, Latin America, and Asia see the chance to rise. But also other countries in Asia had an economic prosperity and upturn, while the so-called countries of the West in general went down. Europe did not progress. The United States, not really. I mean, I'm not talking about paper value. I'm talking about real economic growth. And there, it was entirely Asia which grew. And, therefore, I think that Iran is just one piece in the larger puzzle. Naturally, it has large oil and gas reserves. Naturally, it's a large, powerful country with a lot of control in Southwest Asia. But it's also allied with China, with Russia. And, I think it is that kind of geopolitical thinking. And, I can only say that if you continue on this road, it will lead to thermonuclear war. I think that's so obvious for anybody who watches the dynamic, not just from one day to the next, but if you look at the, how this machine is growing and growing. And the only solution is what I have said since the Ukraine war started, that, we have to get out of this geopolitical geometry by establishing a new paradigm. And the lesson obviously is the Peace of Westphalia. The Peace of Westphalia ended 150 years of religious war in Europe, where the war went back and forth. And in the 30 Years' War, which was the final culmination of this period, 1/3 of everything was destroyed. 1/3 of cattle, of villages, of housing, of people. And, it's only because you had some intelligent people who said, if we continue this game, we all will be dead and there will be absolutely nobody who will enjoy the victory. And is that not the situation we are facing today? If this escalates into a war anywhere, let's say, in Europe, where some people think a tactical nuclear war would be possible without that it expands to a global war, which I think is completely foolish, then, we are looking at the end of history, but in a very different way than Fukuyama was talking about 30 years ago. So therefore, we need to draw the lesson from the Peace of Westphalia. We have to create a new security and development architecture which takes into account the interest of every single country on the planet. And that's not so impossible, because if you think about it, at the time of the German unification, 89, and the disintegration of the Soviet Union in 91, there was a discussion, to create a European house and to have a peace order from Vladivostok to Lisbon. And in 2000, when Clinton President Clinton visited Moscow, Putin even thought, that Russia could join NATO. This was in 2000. So that's not so long ago. And maybe NATO is now not the appropriate vehicle. But I think if one really would want to solve this, one would say, how can we create a security order which takes into account the need and security desires of every country? This is what Putin had asked from the US and NATO on the 17th of December in 21, a couple of weeks, actually 2 months before the war broke out, and the US and NATO did not respond. And that's why, this last chance to prevent the war was avoided. But, a security interest for every single country can only occur if you have economic development for everybody. That is why we are not talking about the security architecture alone, but that's why we are saying that the new peace for development is development. The new name for peace is development, which means, you have to basically reorganize the present situation in financial architecture in such a way that it allows for that. And if it requires, 4 years of negotiations, like in the Peace of Westphalia, so be it. I think it can be done much faster. But, I think that from the standpoint of most of the players in the present strategic situation, this is possible. I know China has made all these proposals for a shared future of humanity, the Global Security Initiative, Global Development Initiative, and a Global Civilizational Dialogue Initiative, which goes in the same direction. And it comes from the fact that China has the idea of a harmonious development of all nations. I think the Global South would full-heartedly welcome if the Global North would agree to this. And, the only force which would not agree with it or not think they profit from it is the military-industrial complex, because, obviously continuous wars creates a lot of profit. But is that worth the end of mankind? Is it not more reasonable to retool these industries and make them produce infrastructure, fast train systems, space technology, cooperate in crash programs for thermonuclear fusion, fourth generation of nuclear energy, of inherently safe nuclear plants? All of these things could be done. And if we want to get out of this situation, it has to be done. So if you agree with us, then you should definitely get active with us, because we need a lot of forces to change this agenda.
Okay, Helga, I have 2 more questions for you. One is from a viewer in Nigeria who said, "Thank you for your expertise and your tireless work. My question is, what is wrong with Ursula von der Leyen and the European Union? Now I hear she's blaming climate change and Putin for the reasons the farmers are marching in Germany. How can she remain so influential and be so wrong on everything?"
Yeah, that is a good question. To be so wrong for one single person, you would need actually an army to be so wrong. But, this woman is just, I think her self-understanding is, the reality is, and many, many people know this in Europe, that the EU has really degenerated into a colonial, how do you say this, a governor for the Anglosphere, the Anglosphere Empire. And Europe has degraded itself to allow to be a colony of the Anglosphere. And I think she feels quite comfortable in having that post. And I think, the idea that it was climate change and Putin who's, responsible for the plight of the farmers is just ridiculous. And the farmers are, if you look at the uproar going on right now, you have the farmers of Greece, Italy, Spain, France, Holland, Germany, all having, hundreds of thousands of tractors. In Rome, you have right now 2,000 tractors. In all these people are in absolute fight for their survival. And they know the reason why they have this problem is because, it's not just the high energy price, the cut of the subsidies, the insane policies of the EU, which are part of the Green Reset, that they're supposed to set aside 30% of the land which would be, used for agriculture, or 4% in the case of France, or that they cannot use pesticides anymore. All of these regulations, which are the result of an ideology. And then you have, in addition, the high energy prices. Well, they come not from Putin, they come from sanctions against Russia, they come from the cut of Russian oil, which was not the decision of Russia. It was the result of the developments around the Nord Stream pipeline. And the farmers are now saying correctly that they are fighting for their very existence, and that they are producing the food we all are dependent on. So there is no way how they will stop. So, I don't know where this will end, but it becomes more radical. The latest reports are that the farmers in Holland have started to put fire on straw and wood, and they put manure in front of the city council houses and mayor's houses. That's getting a little bit wild, but I'm not there to judge what the measures they are using. The point is, we need a reform of this entire system, where the physical economy and the economy in the service of the well-being of the people is being put back on the agenda, and not by cutting all the areas of common good for the advantage of the profit of a few. The billionaires are becoming more rich, and the mass of the population becoming poorer and poorer. The middle class is vanishing, and that is a system which obviously cannot continue. And we are about to see that crashing against the wall. So that's why the proposals we have made in the 10 principles for a new security and development architecture are absolutely to be put on the agenda. And I would really urge you, read these 10 principles, because you need a comprehensive approach. We are long beyond the time where you can just fix a little problem on a local level. You need to really have a comprehensive approach to fix the whole system.
Well, Helga, a final question here, again taking advantage of your expertise on German politics. This is from a German supporter of the Schiller Institute, who asks, do those marching allegedly against fascism in Germany recognize the irony that their government is supporting genocide in Southwest Asia?
Well, it is very funny, because this so-called corrective, this group of journalists, who have, by the way, funding from very right-wing US sources, and the North Rhine-Westphalian government is the second largest funder. we are just right now looking into this because it's a real orchestration. Because what they claim these fascists in parentheses in Potsdam were discussing was exactly the same what the German government had demanded one day before, to have an offensive to bring, to basically relocate a lot of the migrants. So there is no difference between what the German government is actually proposing and in part doing and what these so-called Nazis or fascists have proposed. And the whole thing is a complete orchestration. And, we were just discussing with several people today that I think this is about to turn because, while people initially were extremely agitated about the AfD and so-called right-wingers, now it turns out that a lot of these, actually millions of people in the streets are demonstrating against the government. So they are using the fact that people are out in the streets and they're just going out because they're boiling over, because they see that, Germany is being destroyed. Everything which was built in generations after the Second World War is going out of the window. People are losing their means to live, their existence. So I think that, the truth about the orchestration of this whole demonstration is slowly but steadily, people realize that this is if you have the mainstream media announcing in great detail the hour and location of these demonstrations, everybody starts to realize that these are government orchestrated demonstrations which have only one aim, and that is to change the agenda. People should be out in the streets demonstrating because of the danger of nuclear war, which is being drummed up every day. You have defense ministers and others talking about the coming war with Russia in Finland, in Sweden. Rob Bauer, the admiral who is the head of the military command of NATO, and others are saying almost every day, you have to prepare for war. You have to have water bottles for the first 36 hours after such an attack from Russia to survive. This is crazy. I mean, this tends to become a self-fulfilling prophecy if we don't change course. That's what people should be demonstrating about, and not some orchestrated reason, which is only an effort to deflect from the real effort.
Well, Helga, thank you for joining us as usual and giving your much appreciated expertise. I want to encourage people again, go to the LaRouche organization website and download the statement that we've issued, Knew or Should Have Known. Governments complicit in genocide will not be able to plead ignorance at the coming Nuremberg tribunal. Get active with us. What you've just heard from Helga is a perfect example of why it is that you can't rely on politicians and governments, but they must become responsive to the interests of the population, and that means you. So Helga, any final words?
No, but I think this is, a moment where the morality of each of us is being tested. And I can only quote the Protestant priest Munter Isaac from Bethlehem, who in a recent webcast reminded people, that in respect to the situation in Gaza, that in the Bible it says, what you are doing to the least of them, you are doing to me. So we should really become much more responsible for what is happening, because if this goes wrong, it will be the fault of all of us, even if there will be nobody left to cry about it.
All right. Well, I'll see you next week. Hopefully we'll make it through the week and have an opportunity again to take questions and give people direction for their activities.
Yes, till next week.